Hello, everyone. Next, I'd like to introduce Johann van Tonder. Johann is a conversion rate optimization specialist. He's co-author of eCommerce Website Optimization and CEO of the eCommerce CRO agency, AWA Digital. Welcome, Johann.
Thank you. Let me try and hit the right buttons. Yes, I'm from AWA Digital. We're a specialist e-commerce CRO agency, and that's what I'm talking about today. This is the guy behind one of the most incredible turnaround stories and has become quite well known. So you may have heard about it or read about it, and therefore I'm not going to repeat the story here today. I'll give you a quick 2-minute summary. Back in the 2000s, early 2000s, the British cycling team was absolutely nowhere. They had managed to win 1 gold medal in the past 100 years, but in that 100 years, they didn't have much else to show for all their effort. And you can look at all the stats, but I think the best illustration of just how dire things were was the fact that one of the main manufacturers, bicycle manufacturers, refused to sell their gear to the Brits because they didn't want their brand to be associated with them. Enter this guy, Sir David Brailsford, and things started changing quite quickly. At the next Olympic Games, they won 60% of all the available gold medals, and the story just started there. They started dominating all the major events and really turned things around spectacularly. Now, that's a remarkable story, but it's not even the most interesting part of it. The most fascinating bit is how they did it, and this is what the story is famous for. So this is the bit you might recognize, and it's here where I'm skipping a lot of details. But Brailsford started off by asking a question, going after a big goal, big audacious objective, and that was to pull themselves out of 100 years of underperformance and start dominating the scene. And where do you start? How do you do that? Where do you get that growth? And what they did was they took cycling, or the cycling performance as a concept, and then deconstructed it, broke it down into hundreds of constituent parts that they thought made up cycling performance. And then they set out to improve each of those areas by just 1%. Now, it sounds crazy because 1%, you look at this and you go, well, that's almost nothing. But if you add those almost nothings together, then you get something. And that's the point here. And the math is actually quite interesting because it's not 1 + 1 + 1 and so on. It's one big win, or a win stacked on top of another win, stacked on top of another win. So it's that compound effect. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But bringing this home, this concept, bringing it home to business and to e-commerce, what does it look like? So like Brailsford, you start with a big goal, a big question. Let's say, how do I double my e-commerce conversion rate, which is something I work with every day? And that's a big deal because if you 2x your conversion rate, you double your online revenue, and actually the profit that drops through to the bottom line is even bigger than that. But it's the same thing. Where do you start? Where are you going to get that 2x growth? How do you find that 100% improvement in this case? So using the same principle, you break it down into smaller parts. And one of the common mental models in e-commerce that you can apply in this case is that flow through the e-commerce site, which you see there. Very high level flow, but it's something to work with. And now you can see where I'm going with this. Well, you might look at this and go, well, there's 5 different areas, so we might need 20% in each of those areas, which gives us 100%. But the math works out such that actually you only need 15% in each of these areas, and the compound effect takes you to 100%. So suddenly that big goal starts looking a lot more achievable. It's far easier to get 15% in 5 different areas than one big swing of 100%. And that's the point of it. And especially then if you start breaking it down further, because to make up 15%, it turns out you only need 5 improvements, each worth 2.84%. So if you put all of that together, 5 times 5, that's 25 ideas that each delivers under 3%. Is that doable? Of course it is. You can do this. We do this every day. And I'll show you 3 quick case studies of the e-com sites that we work with, and give you an idea of how they do this. The first one, we work with a few florist brands. This is one of them. And to protect their identity and also hopefully to pull out some of the salient points, I've made a very rough sketch of what I hope looks like a product detail page, a PDP. Now, a bit of context here. These bouquets are all handcrafted. So if you and I buy the same product, what we'll receive will be slightly different. There'll be nuances because it's handcrafted. And we knew from speaking to customers on the site that they like this, but they'd also like to have a little bit more control over what they receive. And this is particularly so when it's somebody close to them or when it's a special occasion. And that's quite a common use case on the site. So we took that background and did the following. You see exactly the same PDP, but now there's a text box that's been added there, and I'll read it with you. It says, anything you'd like the florist to know when creating your bouquet. So there's an opportunity for you as a customer to give input into the design process. Now, which one do you think did better, A or B? I'll give you a few moments while I take a sip of water to think which one you would bet on. I often play this game with live audiences, and it's quite interesting to see that every time there's quite a split in these guessing games. But the answer, if you guessed B, you would be correct. That delivered a 4.6% increase in conversion rate at 95% statistical significance. Now, that last bit of the statement, the 95% statistical significance, that's a mouthful, and it's a rabbit hole that I'm not going to go into, but what it comes down to is it's using the same math, the same statistical rigor that's used by the medical industry when they determine whether a medicine is actually effective. So it's doing statistical calculations to determine whether there's a real difference and not just something in the data that looks like there is a win there, but in reality it doesn't exist. So here's another one. And you'll see the difference between the top one, the original, and the bottom one there is just the menu items having been reordered. So it's the same menu items, but they're presented in a slightly different hierarchy. And what's behind that is on this particular site, it's a luxury fashion brand. We know from research that discovery is a very important part of the journey. So that browsing behavior correlates with revenue. But the problem is the original, the top variation you see there, the way those menu items are organized, that's it doesn't match the patterns of how users actually behave on the site. So the one at the bottom attempts to address that, to align them with customer preferences. And actually there's some more variations, two more. You can see them as C and D there. And in this case, it's the same principle, but it also adds some restyling into the mix. And actually the one, to get straight to the punchline, the one that did the best was number D there. And it delivered an increase of 10.68%. So that's almost 11% increase in conversion rate from this one change. Again, 95% statistical significance, the same rigor. But what's interesting about this one is that in some circles, that concept where if you look at D, you'll see the menu items, the filters have been hidden behind a button click. So there's an extra click involved there. And in some circles, that'll be frowned upon because it's perhaps not in line with UX best practice. And despite that violation, and this delivered a clear win. And we see that quite often. And now to the last case study. And this is a very stripped down sketch of a basket page. But I've highlighted the element in question. Now, at the top of this, you can imagine the summary of the products that are in your cart. So this is the basket page. And it's all the right things, right, you would expect. So you've got standard delivery and it's free. You've got a nice discount there. And then it's quite clear what you have to pay. So that's great. And it works quite well. But remember, what we're trying to do is we're trying to find ways to improve each area by that proverbial 1%. And you've already seen it's never just 1%. It's a lot more than that. But that's what we're trying to do. So we're not going after things that don't work well only. We're also trying to improve things that work reasonably well already. And in this case, what we knew, and it's quite common, is that, look, delivery is often a big passion killer, especially in South Africa, but also overseas. And what people wanted to know at this stage was, well, what about the delivery time? How long is it going to take after I click the button for this thing to actually arrive on my doorstep? So what we did in this case, you can see on the right there, is added that extra information. So if you look at bullet number 2, you'll see the time frame being clearly communicated. And actually, there's an additional bonus there. So this is high tech that's being imported from abroad. And what it's saying there is you don't have to worry about the cost, the import cost. We'll cover that. And I'll give you another few seconds to make up your mind. Which one do you think would win, A or B? So in this case, if you guessed A, it's a good guess, but I'm afraid you're wrong. And if you're wrong, congratulations. It means you're perfectly normal, because the fact is that nobody can predict the outcome of any of these ideas, and that's why we test them. What I've shown you up until now is A/B tests, where we test the original versus this challenger, this idea that hopes to improve things. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And we surprise ourselves every day. The problem is that unless you're testing, unless you're doing it side by side, and unless you're applying that statistical rigor that I mentioned, you're you're definitely making the wrong decision more often than you can imagine. And unfortunately, this compound effect that I've been talking about can also work against you. So in the same way, you stack the wins and the compound makes that hockey stick curve to the top. If you stack some losses in there, it's a race to the bottom. And let me explain that a little bit more. So this is a graphic representation of 10 ideas. They're numbered there 1 to 10. And the reason they're green bars is because this team, this hypothetical team, believes that they're all wins. That's why they're green. It's just the magnitude of lift is a little bit different, but you got 10 wins there, is the assumption. What actually happened, unbeknown to them, is this, that yes, they had 4 wins, but they also had 3 losses without knowing it. So 3 of those ideas that they thought were wins were actually negative, hurting sales. And the rest are neutral. So it doesn't make a difference. It's not better, it's not worse, but you've wasted your team's resources. You've wasted their time and budget working on things that don't move the needle. Now, the best teams in the world, and I'm not going to go through the list, but it includes the likes of Google. The best teams in the world are wrong between 7 and 9 times out of 10. So I'm going to spell that out, what it means for the best teams in the world. Out of every 10 ideas they test, they find that only between 1 and 3 actually move the needle in the right direction. The rest are either negative or don't make a difference. And this is backed up by research from Harvard Business School, so it's solid, but it's also supported by thousands upon thousands of data points from the industry over the last 10 years of running tests. Now, the question is, if that's the hit rate for the best teams in the world, why would it be different for you and me? The truth is we're all similar. It's just those teams have a way of identifying the wins and have a way of flushing out the rest. They have a system to do that. Let's look at that a little bit more. So this you might recognize, it's the way things are done in most companies, I'd say, in South Africa. Overseas, it's changed a little bit, but even there, it's still a reality. So there's an idea, and it's never just one idea, is it? Because if you've had a shower, you've had an idea. So there are multiple ideas of how you might improve things, how you might increase your conversion rate or sales or whatever it is, what metric you want to improve. So you've got these ideas, but you can't act on all of them. So there's usually a bit of a debate. It could be days, it could be weeks. I regularly see months. So it could be months of debating for some ideas. And the ideas that survive that phase of debating are not necessarily the best ones. They're the ones that are supported by people higher up in the hierarchy, people with big titles, or people who happen to have a strong opinion expressed in a very persuasive way in a meeting. So those are the ideas that survive and get thrown over the fence at engineering. And now the developers spend another couple of weeks implementing those ideas and then finally launching them. And when they launched, then you convince yourself that you've done the right thing. You convince yourself that this has made a positive impact. You might even find data to support that. And if you have a trained data scientist looking at that same data, that person might come to a different conclusion. But the brain is wired in that way. You have to convince yourself. It's actually, it's a mechanism for protection. You're wired in that way. You have to convince yourself that you've made the right decision. Can you imagine going through all of this effort, spending all of this money, all this time, and then telling yourself that you've made the wrong decision, telling your team that it's been the wrong decision, communicating that up the chains, it's just not something that's going to happen. So you convince yourself it's right, but actually you've potentially hurt sales. Here's the other way of doing it, the CRO way of doing it, and the way that winning teams are doing it. So again, there are many ideas, nothing changes there. But instead of debating those ideas, these teams accept that they can't predict the outcome of an idea. They accept that they're going to be surprised. They know what they don't know. And so the way to find out is to test it on real customers. And so as quickly as possible, they roll it out, not live on the site, but as a test, run it for a couple of weeks in front of live users, and then use the data, as I've explained, and the statistics to determine whether it's something they should keep or not. You'll still be wrong up to 9 out of 10 times. The difference here is you know when you're wrong and you don't go ahead with those, so you don't hurt your sales, and you only keep the winners. And you also don't burden your already stretched development resources with requests that are frankly stillborn from a business perspective. So here's the final quick case study, quick story from our stable. This is a UK-based organization. Spent months using various agencies and internal teams coming up with a new checkout flow. And to skip through a lot of detail and get straight to the bottom line, when we tested this, we realized this would have amounted to £7 million of lost revenue on an annual basis. So had they gone ahead with that, this is what they would have faced. What we did in this case was to, through testing, get it to a point where it's at least neutral, and then through further testing, iterate on top of it to get it to a point where it's better than the current environment. And now I'm going to wrap up with something that hopefully brings all of this together. What you're looking at there is a revenue curve from the search engine Bing, stretching over 2 years. And in this particular period, they saw 55% growth. So it's hard to see in that graph. You see the ups and downs and the seasonal swings, but that's a strong upward trend, 55% growth over 2 years. And that's actually phenomenal if you consider who they're competing against, Google. And what's behind this, if you now plot on top of that all the releases, then you can see that it's never just one big swing or even a couple of big swings. It's all these small incremental improvements, exactly that principle we spoke about at the top of the call with that notion introduced by Brailsford, the aggregation of marginal gains. That's what you're seeing here. And each of these packages is the result of many experiments that they've run, where they've validated their ideas and cut out the ones that didn't work and only kept the winners. And that's what you're seeing here. And that's where that consistent growth is coming from. And Bloomberg and Forrester and a few other organizations, Harvard Business School as well, have studied this over the last couple of years and found consistently that teams and organizations that follow this approach by far outperform the rest in terms of share price, revenue, and all the key KPIs. And I'm going to leave you with this quote from Harvard Business Review recently. At a time when the web is vital to almost all business, rigorous online experiments should be standard operating procedure. That's what we've been talking about. CRO at the heart of it is rigorous online experiments. And what they're saying is that it shouldn't be bolted on. It becomes a way of working because it helps you to make the best decision every time. And that's really what it's about. Because every decision that you make every day stacks up in a compound fashion over time. And you better hope it's the right decision that you make every day, because that's where that curve is going to come from. You don't want to go the other way. And that brings us to the end. Thanks very much. And I hope that I can get an opportunity to speak to some of you.